My name's Corey Fry, by the way. I'm the exhibitions manager here at the Della Plain Art Center. I'm really excited about our talk today from Dr. Pamela Harris Lawton. I'm going to read a short bio. Pamela asked me to keep it shorter, but you better believe, like, there's a whole list of honors and awards and books that she's been a part of and exhibitions that she's been a part of. We were talking about her work at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and so I think we're in for a treat today. But Dr. Lawton is the Florence Gaskins Harper Endowed Chair in Art Education and a thought leader for the Hurwitz Center at the Maryland Institute College of Art. She earned a BA degree in studio art and sociology at the University of Virginia, an MFA in printmaking from Howard University, and then, I don't know how you say this.
EDD, that's fine.
EDD from Teachers College at Columbia University. So if you would, welcome Dr. Lawton.
Thank you so much, Corey. Thank you for being here. So, you see this large word, art stories. So art stories is how I refer to my personal practice as an artist and my practice as a teaching artist out in the community. So I'll explain a little bit more about how I came up with that. But to start with, a little bit about me personally. So I'm a native of Washington, D.C., a product of the public schools there, and I'm a fifth generation educator. So what you see here is my great-great-grandma over here on the far right. She was a student of one of Deborah's husband's family members on the Amber side many years ago in the 1850s. And she became one of the first teachers in the colored school system when they started it in 1868. So every generation, and I have a horrible feeling it's going to end with me. I don't think I have too many more teachers coming up. And then there's my great-grandma, my grandma, my mom, and then there's me. I taught at the Corcoran for 7 years, which is where Deborah and I worked together, which was wonderful. And so as a very young person in the public schools in DC, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to printmaking. My art teacher put me in this program that was run by the Smithsonian for 24 years before it just ended. And they opened up a professional printmaking studio in the galleries in what's now American Art, down where the Portrait Gallery and the American Art Gallery connect. So I was fortunate to learn, this is me in high school, learning how to do stone lithography as a high school student. And so I kind of fell in love with that. And so printmaking has been my way of not only expressing myself as an artist, but also developing community with students, because printmaking is a very communal sort of activity. So what you see here is one of my community projects when I was a faculty member at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, working with a homeless community there, and then working with teachers, doing professional development with teachers, and that's like a little printmaking project I was doing with teachers. So about me professionally, I didn't want Corey to read all that stuff, but prior to coming to MICA, I was at Virginia Commonwealth University down in Richmond, where I was there for 5 years, and then had the fortune to come and get this job at MICA. And prior to that, I was the director of education studies at the Corcoran College of Art and Design. It was so sad to see the museum just kind of go. And since then, I have been a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Scotland, which is where I got the sweater. And I did a community project there. That's this picture you see here with immigrant youth from African countries in Southeast Asia. And I'll show a little bit more on that. While I was over there, I had the opportunity to be a Tate exchange artist at the Tate in London, and I worked with 1,800 people on a project there. I'll talk a little bit about that. And as I mentioned, my studio practice is primarily printmaking, some mixed media and book arts, and so my research as both an artist and an art educator revolves around visual narrative in intergenerational settings. So I'm really interested in how generations come together and learn from each other through art activity. So, well, who are my influences? Elizabeth Catlett is probably one of my major influences. I've just really admired her. And when I was a graduate student at Howard, the first thing they told us was, you've got to think about what you're going to do for your thesis. This was like the first semester of school. And I was like, thesis, I just got here. Anyway, I went into the gallery. Oh, hi, Jeff. It's an old friend of mine. I went into the gallery and saw all these amazing prints that Elizabeth Catlett had made in the 30s, and they were all about strong black women. And I said, that's what I know. That's what I grew up around. And so I saw this piece in, it wasn't in the Howard Gallery, but I saw it somewhere else, and it inspired me to create this piece. And so a couple of years later, or maybe a year or so later, Elizabeth Catlett was in town, and she was giving a talk, and there was this gallery that had all of her work, and here I am, a graduate student with no money, and I was thinking, oh, I just would really like to buy one of her pieces. And somebody said, well, if you look in the back there, there's some loose prints. You should just go and look and see if there's anything back there. And lo and behold, that was there. So it took me a year, but I bought that. So I have that print, and I have to say, you have to invest in art, right? Because it's just something that gives you joy, and you never know. So she was a big inspiration of mine. And more contemporarily, Steve Prince. I don't know how many of you know Steve Prince. He was in the DC area for a while, but he is at William & Mary. He's at William & Mary working with their gallery there. And he does these mammoth woodcuts. I mean, he does everything, sculpture, painting. But this is one of his woodcuts, and it's about Rosa Parks on the bus. And so I'm a real admirer of his, and I reached out to him to work with me on a project that I did. And this is LaToya Hobbs. I don't know how many of you are familiar with LaToya, but she lives in Baltimore. She also teaches at MICA, and she does these mammoth woodcuts. This one was at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and I think one or two of them are now in other collections. But each panel, it's like 3 panels of 4 by 8 foot pieces of wood. So you can imagine how big that is. And she did actually print them on paper, but she displays the wood itself, which I think is very interesting. So what are art stories? So this is, like I said, it's a term that I use to describe my practice as holistically, as an artist, my personal work, as well as work that I do in communities. And it's forms of narrative. They can be oral, visual, written, performed. It's a concept of integrated arts learning curriculum theory, like putting people together who are all different ages and learning from each other, because I think that's how most of us started learning. We learned with our families before we went to school. And they're actually artworks that can be read or performed or shared with others as a means of developing community. And it's a kind of a community arts-based educational research projects that I have been doing throughout my career, which I'm going to share with you. So in terms of my personal artwork, this was a desk. So my great-grandfather, when he retired from the government, he had such an interesting story. He was in medical school. He went blind. So he was in medical school while he was working for the government. So he's working a full-time job, and he's in medical school. He loses his sight. Freaks him out, obviously. So he drops out of medical school. He eventually gets his sight back. He decides to go to business school after that. And when he retires from the government, he starts making these desks. He just kind of made this up on his own. It's a foldable desk. This part comes down, and you close it with a skeleton key. And you can see I have totally just taken one of the desks and done my own thing with it. But basically what I did was I did an honorary piece to his life. And so I've got information about him on the outside of the desk, and then I sculpted these hands of him in the act of making these really tiny blueprints he used to make for everything he made. And he made incredible doll houses. Some of them are in the Smithsonian. You wouldn't even believe them to see them, but they all had wiring in the walls and switches that turned on the lights in different rooms. And so he made most of his money in retirement from that than his government pension. He actually sustained himself and his family that way. So that's, a lot of my work is about the stories of people in my family who've inspired me. So that's one piece. And this is the piece that Corey mentioned that's at the Women's Museum. So this is actually the story of his life here. And my sister and I, having played with one of the doll houses as kids, and our grandmother telling us the story of her dad's life. So these are actually images of wood engravings of images of actual doll houses that he made. So that story is there at the Women's Museum in their book arts collection. And then more recently, some of the stuff I've been doing, like I say, it's printmaking, it's mixed media. My mom died in 2020 after a long battle with dementia. And so I started thinking about, how our lives kind of intersected and how we were alike. And so to kind of work through my grief, I made this weird kind of exquisite corpse game of me and my mom at different points from early childhood to young adulthood to older age. And the point of the game was for other people to play it, right? And think about the mother figures in their lives as they're playing it. And I called it Nexus. And then as a part of the pandemic, every once in a while I do these weird self-portraits. And this one was based on the story that a friend of mine was telling me about Be the Coffee. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this little internet story, but the story goes like this. There was a young girl who was in hot water. She just, was not happy, and she went to her mother complaining. And her mother said, well, you could either be a carrot, and when you're in hot water, you get limp, and weak, or you could be an egg, which when you're boiled in hot water, you get a really hard shell and you're hard, or you could be the coffee. The hotter the water, the stronger you get. And so that story was one that one of my artist friends was telling me, and I said, this is the time for me to be the coffee. So I thought about, that story, and I kind of encapsulated it there just in calligraphy, and then thought about Black women and the nature of Black women being like the different shades of coffee, so we come in so many different colors and types, and yet we're all unified. So that was what that piece was about. And this piece is going to be in an exhibit later this month at Wesley Seminary. And it's a show on art and spirituality. And so I was thinking about where do I feel my most spiritual is when I'm singing. So that's another thing that I do. I do sing. So this is just a self-portrait of me singing in the choir that I was in. I was the only Black person in that choir when I was in Charlotte. And I very much enjoyed it. So there's a QR code where you can hear me singing on it. So that's just a temptation. So if you go to the show, you can see it. And more recently, I was working on this piece. It's called On the Record, For the Record. And so it's actually pieces of record that make up the hair of Angela Davis and Bell Hooks and some of their sayings. And this was a double record album that I used to create the piece. So, politics obviously are on my mind too at this point. And there's a group that goes around, it's called Big Ink, and they travel from city to city. I told them to contact the Delaplane, so maybe they'll come next year. But they bring this big press that prints up to 90 inches. And it travels. Yeah, it's really wild. And so what they do is they reach out to people. You can sign up as they go all over the country to all these different art centers. And they've been at Pyramid Atlantic. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that place, but I decided to try it. And so the smallest piece you can make is 24 by 36. So I made the smallest piece, and I just threw everything in there. That's on my mind right now politically, global warming, gun violence, women having rights to their bodies. I mean, just everything. So that's what that piece was about. And right now it's at the Women's Caucus show, which is at the Montpelier Cultural Arts Center. Just so if you want to catch up with me. And in terms of books, that's something I've always had an interest in. I don't know, maybe because I used to like to read them so much, and I like to make them now. But these are some books that I made when I was in Mexico. So I was invited to go to Mexico to be a visiting artist when I was faculty at the Corcoran. And then while I was there, someone asked me, they said, well, I'm thinking about doing a project with young girls who've been abandoned here, and they're at this home. Would you be interested in coming down with your students and working with them? So I said, yes. So this is how, morphing from my own personal practice puts me in connection with people to do other things within communities. So these are some of the books I made when I was in Mexico, and then I went back later, and I'll show you a little bit later on the work that my students and I did with the girls there. Let's see, these are two different books. So right when I came out of graduate school at Columbia, I was like, got gung-ho to get my first college teaching job, get the job, and I'm like, I don't have time to make any art, so I'm like, running around learning how to be a college teacher. And so I reached out to two of my friends who were doing the same thing, and I said, listen, I'm gonna make this altered book. I'm gonna put a couple of pages in it, I'm gonna mail it to you. I want you to do a couple of pages and mail it to the other person. Well, I did get it back. It was a year later, But each of my friends, Chrissy Stakitis, who's a printmaker and a painter, and Lisa Hochtritt, who teaches with me at MICA, when I got the book back, it was filled with all these crazy pieces of art that, we were just trying to make art however we could, to keep our fingers in it. This piece here is the one that's at the Tate Britain Library. So when I was over doing my Fulbright, right before I left, Virginia Commonwealth University got this opportunity. They were the only non-UK university to have an artist come over and do a project with the community coming into the Tate. So they have this space on the 5th floor called the Exchange Space. And it's a space where artists work, they have some kind of project, and people just coming into the Tate, they come up to the 5th floor and they can just get involved with whatever the project is. And each artist has like a week. So they picked one person from my university, and I said, well, I should apply because I'm going to be over there. I'll be over in the UK. And so I did get selected. So after I finished my Fulbright, I spent a week in July, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if I just bought a whole bunch of old books? Because Edinburgh, which is where I was, is a very literary town. They have all these bookshops, and so I bought like 30 some odd books, dragged them on a train down to London. And then people came in over the course of that week, 1,800 people. I convinced the university to send one of my students to help me. She was very happy to be in the UK for a week. But we worked with 1,800 people, and they altered different books. This is the one that I created. And I said, I'm saving this one for me because I thought it was amazing. This book was being still published like up until like a year or two ago. And it was written by a man, his name's there somewhere, but it's called, Joseph Johnson. It's Clever Girls of Our Time and How They Became Famous Women. So I looked at it, and of course there were no women like me in it. So I altered the book and I put all these famous black women in it. So the book has both black and white women in it. And so now it's at the Tate Britain Library, but anyway. And so are all the other books that the people created during that week. So it was kind of a crazy but fun week. Then I decided, how many people talk about their teachers when they become artists? Well, I'm a teacher, so I totally appreciate it. And I said, I want to do a series with my teachers, the people who influenced me. So I actually did some video interviews with my teachers, and then I said, I want to do a woodcut portrait of you. They're like, fine, because I figured I could use their wisdom in my own teaching. And students get tired of hearing me talk all the time, so wouldn't it be great to hear my teachers speak? This was my elementary school art teacher. She's 96. And she just got New York gallery representation like a year ago. So she's living her best life towards the end of her life right about now. But I remember her because she was my elementary school art teacher. She was art on a cart. She took everything around. She did ceramics with us. She had to take it somewhere and have it fired, bring it back, have us glaze it, take it back and fire it. She put it in shows. So you can imagine, right? So this was the late 60s. The last time I saw her was 1968. And in 2008, I'd moved from Charlotte, where I was teaching, back here to the home area, and I was teaching at the Corcoran. And I wound up living at our family beach home for a little bit. And I was talking to a neighbor, and they asked what I did. So I told them, and I said, I'll never forget my art teacher, Lillian Thomas Burwell. And she says, oh, she lives up the street. I said, you're kidding. So that's how the idea for this project started. I went around, and I started having these conversations with Lillian, and she is still supporting me to this day. So, and that's my high school teacher who signed me up for the printmaking program at the end there. He keeps up with me. So it's just amazing. Some of my college professors. So then from that, it morphed into, what about all the amazing black women art educators? They might not have been my teachers, but they were in some sense my mentors. So I've started a side project now. There's Alma Thomas. This is Delilah Pierce, who was a well-known black woman art educator, artist from this area. And Dr. Margaret Burroughs from Chicago. So that's a whole nother thing that I'm doing. So I'm looking for maybe a place to do a solo show for these works. So I'm continuing to work on these portraits. Now, one of the things I mentioned to you is how printmaking is a very collaborative sort of experience, right? So when the pandemic hit, like everybody, I was just kind of like, oh, you know, stuck at home and just disconnected, right? Teaching online. So I started at MICA teaching online. So I started a new job. I didn't even get to go on campus at all. So my whole first year was teaching online. I went to campus to get my computer, and that was it. So one of my former students, believe it or not, who's my age and a really good friend, Audra Burrows, she's an amazing artist. She said, listen, Pam, I'm calling you because I want you to be part of this art project. And I'm like, I don't know, I'm so, out of it. She says, you need to do this. So she and two of her art friends decided to reach out. Each of them would reach out to two other artists, and they came up with this idea to do a collaborative book project connected to this crazy time we're in, this once in 100 years time. Think about it. So you had COVID, you had the violence going on with people. There's just so much going on to bring you down. So we decided to make books about this time. Who knows, maybe someday, 100 years from now, somebody will look at them and say, boy, that was really a crazy time 100 years ago. So I said, okay, I'd do it. So the idea was we would take a book, make a book however we wanted. It couldn't be larger than 12 by 12 though. So I decided to alter a book. I took the guts out of one of those books I still had from Scotland and was working with that. And then every month we would mail it to one of the other artists. They would put something in based on the theme of our book and mail it to the next person. So there were 9 of us. So at the end of 9 months, we would get our books back with 8 other artists' work in it. Brilliant, right? So we go through 2 months of this, and as some of you may remember, there was also problems with the Postal Service. So one person's book got stolen. Now, mind you, 2 of these artists were in New York. The rest of us were all in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area. So one of the artists who invited the 2 New York artists said, well, you know what? I'm just going to mask up, get on the train, and go to New York and hand deliver the books. And we were like, are you sure you want to do that? Now, she did have a son living there, a new grandbaby, so she was going to go anyway. But it was still, it was a very scary time to think about being on a train. So then we said, well, if you can do that, why don't we just start meeting in person? So we started masking up and meeting on people's porches, and it really changed the whole nature of the whole thing, because some of these women I didn't even know, right? I was invited by my friend, and I knew of some of the women, some I'd never met. So we have developed this very close bond now after 9 months, and we started showing the books different places. The Library of Congress just purchased the books from us. So that was a really big deal. So as a result, we developed a collective called Dandelion Black Women Artists. And why dandelion? Because oftentimes, like weeds, women are kind of thrown to the side, but we keep popping up, and we're very resistant, and we have a lot of health properties. So that's the name of our collective, and this is some of us at Pyramid Atlantic, where the books were first shown. Then they were shown at the Southside Community Arts Center. They were shown at MICA, and in New York at the Bob Blackburn place. So anyway, that to me that has been the sustainable thing. So we Zoom meet every month. We're talking about what we're going to do next. And so we have all this stuff going on. So in terms of how do I envision my practice as a whole, I look at art as a call to action, a way of connecting, collaborating, and creating through art-based activity that is asset-centered. And when I say assets, I mean like when I'm working in the communities, I'm not going to work with communities because I feel bad for them or that they need me to pull them out of some horrible situation. I'm going because they have assets. Every community has assets. We can't just think about communities as being deficit. And so that's a very important piece of community work. And listening to people's stories, learning from them, building leaders, like if I'm going with my students into some of these communities, and teaching them to be more inclusive and equitable. So part of that was, I've been doing this sort of work for like over 20 years and have written a book about it with 2 of my friends. So what I'm going to talk about is basically in the book, it's like how I envision community-based work happening. So to me, community-based art education, it's not about making sure that you can make this perfect painting or mural or whatever you're doing together, but it's actually about the learning that's happening while you're making. What are you learning about other people? What are you learning about art processes? What are you learning about yourself? That is the important piece. So it's not just community art or social engaged art or public art, it's community-based art education. And so that's how I look at it. So it's asset focused, and it's about developing a rapport with other people. I know people throw the word trust around quite a bit, and I think that that's difficult. I don't think you would just automatically trust somebody right off the bat. I think you have to develop a rapport with them first, and that trust comes from that. So here's, and people always laugh at this because I call this framework the ERECT framework. I love acronyms for stuff. And to erect means to build, to develop something. So in terms of that, the E is for educational, reciprocal, empowering, collaborative, and transformative. To me, that's what community arts work should be about. It should touch on each one of those things. There should be some learning involved. There should be some, not with the teacher being on a pedestal, but as a part of that learning community, you know, facilitating, but not being like, do this, do that, right? Reciprocal in that everybody should be equally heard and have a stake in it that they want. You know, if you're involved in a community project and you're being told to do something, but you don't really want to do it, you know, what else can you do? What else can you offer that person so that they feel that they have a stake in it? Also, being empowering. That might not always happen, but you want to feel like you've been empowered through that art practice or with those other people in some way. And then collaborative is very important, you know, listening to other people. That's part of working communally. You kind of have to learn how to work with other people. That's what we need to do in this country. And then transformational, the possibility of transformation happening. It might not always happen, but it could. People might walk out of there after having done whatever the project is, talk to somebody else about it, do this project again with some other group of people, and in that way, you know, they've transformed not only themselves, but maybe their own little community in some way. So here's some examples, and I mean, all of those principles fit into each of these projects, but I just pulled out some of them so that, you know, because I think it was maybe more collaborative than some of the other things that happened. This was the very first project I did as a graduate student in New York, and it was an artist book project, and I was interested in, because I come from a multi-generational family, grew up with my grandparents and, you know, all their siblings, and had that around all the time. My grandmother was a musician, one of her cousins was a dancer, her brother was an actor, the other brother was a writer, so all that stuff. The arts was a big part of, you know, growing up. And I noticed as a high school teacher that the two senior volunteers in the school were always being, you know, the kids were just attracted to them like magnets because they listened to them, they spent time with them. And so I said, you know what, maybe all these kids don't have access to a grandparent. Maybe all these grandparents or seniors don't have access to children. So what could I do to connect people who are not blood related through an art project, right? That would fulfill some of that. So that was what my dissertation was about, basically. That was what the original Art Stories was. It was using art and story to connect different generations. But what I didn't think about was my generation, which was the middle. So I had a bunch of teenagers, I had a bunch of older adults working together at this settlement house in New York, the Goddard Riverside Settlement House. But my good friend Chrissy said, well, Pam, I'll work on the project with you. And I noticed that her group, which was 3 generations, had a whole different dynamic than the other groups that were just 2 generations. And so I learned something from that, right? And it was that she was kind of like this mediating force, you know, kind of. So it was very interesting to see that and how it played out. So I did that 3 different times and, you know, kind of wrote up all the research on it. And it was kind of the basis for what this became. Later on, when I was out of grad school and teaching, my second teaching job was in Charlotte, as I mentioned. And one of the faculty there she was really, she was one of those fire starters. You know, she'd take the kids, she'd say, listen, they said at the mall that you can't wear a hoodie, you can't sit on the floor, so we're gonna go to the mall, we're gonna wear a hoodie, and we're gonna sit on the floor. So I'm like, Frances, you know. So Frances was all about bucking everything. So she was working with this place called the Urban Ministries in Charlotte. So it's downtown Charlotte, right in the middle of downtown. And there was this little tiny train depot that was pretty much kind of abandoned. And that's where they had services for people who were homeless. So they fed them, they had counseling services, and they actually had an art program. And so the art program was they would provide art supplies to people who wanted to paint or do whatever, but they didn't really have anybody instructing them because the guy who was in charge of it was into soccer. That was his thing. So he started a homeless soccer team, believe it or not. They played in South Africa, they played in Scotland. So that's what you see here, these guys playing soccer. And they had a gardening program. And a lot of the stuff that they made in the garden, they sold to restaurants, right? So they had this wonderful whole thing going on there. And they said, well, we want to do something to thank all the people who gave money for us to build a brand new building across the street from this depot. So they wanted a quilt. I was like, ooh, okay, because I don't know anything about sewing. So I said, okay, we'll do a quilt. I said, if I can do printmaking on a quilt, that's fine. So Francis and I and a couple of our students for like 9 weeks, we sat outside where they were going to get their food, and we had this whole table of art supplies, and people would just come in and make a square, you know? And so we eventually wound up making 2 quilts, because I then said, hey, listen, the university is asking for art for their new building for social studies and nursing. I said, this is perfect. Why don't we make another quilt and get them to buy it from us? So they did. And so this other quilt was about the people that we met there, the artists that we worked with. And so it's hanging at the university, and the other quilt is hanging in the building there at the Urban Ministry Center. So if you're ever in Charlotte, stop by and see it. This is right by the McCall Center, which is this big art center in Charlotte. And people will always say, where's that art center? Oh, no, not that one, the other one, where the people are selling their paintings. This was a woodcut project that I did. And I said it was reciprocal because it was one of the only times I've ever done a project in a school, as opposed to doing something in a community. And this was at the Martin Luther King Middle School in Richmond. And the 2 art teachers there said, okay, Pam, we're willing to have you come into our class after school, after their long day. And I would bring some of my students, and we sat down and we worked all together around this table, the students with their teachers, and they were like, wow, you're gonna sit here and work with us? Because they'd never actually been on the same level with their teacher. So that was exciting for them. And so we did these woodcuts about community. What does community mean to you? And specifically the Richmond community, like what's unique about it? So if you sit there and come up with questions to ask people, they will generate their own ideas. And so one kid said, well, Richmond is full of railroads. There's railroads everywhere. I said, okay, that's good, that's one thing. And I said, what else? And somebody said, well, there's the river. The river is really important here in Richmond. So I said, okay, so those of you who said railroads, incorporate some part of the railroad in your piece. And the others incorporated some part of the river in their piece. And they each had a 12 by 16 piece of wood. They'd never worked with it before. We're all sitting there carving. And then on printing day, I said, I'm going to get a steamroller. And we're going to go into the parking lot. And everybody who wants to, after we ink these up, you can roll over it with the steamroller and print it. And so everybody, the kids, everybody started writing over. There's the steamroller, you can see it. And so we had the pieces on display at the Visual Arts Center in Richmond, at the school, the middle school, and in the community. There was a gallery in the community that it's called Gallery 5. I'm not sure if it's there anymore. And then, as you see here, this person who's coming to see the show, we had a photojournalism student working with us, and they were videotaping and interviewing the students about the experience and so forth. And so what she did was she gave us all these videos so that there's a little app called an augmented reality app that you could have on your phone. If you came to see the show and you held it up in front of one of these pieces, you would get a little video clip of the person either cutting that wood or somebody printing it with the steamroller or something like that. And then here's, you can probably tell which is my students' work and which is the middle school students' work out of this, but this is one of the prints. Here's the project I was telling you about in the UK. So while I was there as a Fulbright scholar, one of the things I had to do was tell them about the work that I was going to do in community. And so I'm talking to all these other scholars from all over the world who are sitting in there, and I decided to go first. I just wanted to get it over with. So January, I got there in January, I gave my talk in January. And so then all of a sudden they said, oh, would you do that with us? Now, mind you, there was one other person who was an artist. They were all different backgrounds. And one was medieval women's history. I said, sure, yeah, like maybe there's some books here we could alter. So the admin comes up, he gives me this box. He says, here, Pam, here's a bunch of books. You can do whatever you want with them. So they worked with me and we created this altered book, which is now in their library there, which I think is so hilarious because they were there to write their books and have them published and then be in this library. And so now this crazy little artwork is in there. And these are the youth that I worked with who were immigrants from all over and had come to Scotland to live. And they were all kind of funneled into this one neighborhood, like on the outside of Edinburgh. And they weren't doing real well. I mean, because there were people who'd been living there for generations, and then of course now all these immigrants are coming in. So there was some tension, and there was an art center there. And I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity, right? To use art to get people together. Well, when I went to meet with the director and the students there, I realized that wasn't going to be good for them because they were having troubles at school, they were having troubles with their teachers even. And they were just, it was just like there was a lot of racism and they were having a hard time adjusting. So I said, they need their own thing. So they wound up wanting to do alphabet books. And I was like, I don't know what the content's gonna be. But what they wound up doing was saying how people should behave. And I thought, how wonderful is that? This one, W, wear your differences like a badge. I thought, how cool. So I found a way to exhibit their books at the Edinburgh College of Arts Book Arts Library. So they had their books up in the Book Arts Library, and they had never been to the college, and so they went and saw the exhibition there. And so you can see some of the books there on exhibition. And then this is the crazy 1,800 people thing at the Tate, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. This is this huge room, and there were all these books, and people just tearing pages out and working on them. And then this is my student who they thankfully flew her in from Richmond to work with me. And we got all 35 of those books together and delivered them to the Tate Britain, which was amazing. And the whole time we were there, finally we said, look, we haven't even been able to see anything in the museum. Can we take a moment to just, see what's up on the walls in here? So it was great. And this was the very first big woodcut thing I did. So you learn something new from everything you do. If you notice the one in Richmond, they all had blocks the same size. This one was, we had these 4x8 pieces of plywood, and it was truly intergenerational. As you can see, this is one of my 70-year-old participants, and she was the one who said, I want to be involved, but I'm not interested in making a woodcut. I said, well, what would you like to do? I want to make a film. So I said, okay, let's make a film. So I put her in charge of making the film of the whole thing, and it turned out great. She has a wonderful voice. And so she's narrating this film and interviewing everybody who was involved. But there were 5 people in 3 groups. Each worked on a woodcut. They had to come together and decide what they wanted the imagery to be and how they wanted us to cut it up. So we cut each one up into 5 pieces, and some of them were really weird, like with sharp points over here and all this weird stuff. And then when they inked them on the inking day and put them together, it just kind of fit together like a jigsaw. But who was going to take all those weird pieces of wood? That's what I learned at the end. Don't do stuff like that, because nobody wants to. I mean, some people took some of the wood, but it didn't make sense because it didn't all come together. But so you can see here, and there's Steve Prince, whose work I showed you earlier. He came out on our printing day and helped us, which was amazing. And so this was with my friend Peg and Melissa, and so I told them we should write a book, and that's how this happened. They wrote the book with me. But this is one of the prints, and it was all around the theme of community, what it meant to them. And so they were on display at the University of Maryland, at the Corcoran, and at the ARC, which is where we actually did the project, which is a community in Southeast Washington, D.C., where they have an arts center. And we put the wood blocks pieces on display. So you can see a piece here. That's kind of a weird piece, right? It's got this little sharp point at the end. So people coming in could see, well, what is this? How do you make it? So they could see the tools, they could see pictures of people working on them, and they also wrote poems about community. I should talk a lot faster. So anyway, I took my students to Nicaragua because one of my students yelled out in class one day, children are dying. So I said, okay, I'm gonna stop class. What are you talking about? She had been to Nicaragua once with a band that was doing a charitable thing to raise money. And these people were living in the dump. They were squatting in the dump. They actually had like a town in the dump. And they don't have recycling like we do. They would go through all that trash and pull out, what could be recycled for a couple of pennies. And as a result, they weren't, living very well. And so they were also selling themselves into prostitution, getting AIDS. Anyway, it was this crazy cycle. So I said, what do you want to do? She said, I want to go down there and make art with them and let them see that there's a beautiful side to life. I said, what happens when we leave? You can't just do that and then leave. What can we do that would be sustainable? So she said, listen, Pam, you got to find a way for us to get down there. I said, I don't mind writing a class to go, but we have to be able to fund it. She says, I will get the money. She got the money. And so I ran the class. We were there for 3 weeks. And while we were there, we noticed that plastic bags, just like here, nobody's recycling them. So I said, I could show them how to crochet with those. So we started crocheting all kinds of purses. One student said, you can iron them and make like sheets that you can cut up and sew into other stuff. And so you see me showing them how to crochet. So this little boy right here, he's so amazing. I thought I could go to Nicaragua and buy a bunch of crochet needles, right? Nope. They had the really teeny tiny ones that wouldn't work. This little boy went over to a tree, broke off a branch. I kid you not. And I had some X-Acto knives because we also did some paper bead work, right? And he made his own crochet needle. It's like, people could be so innovative when they don't have everything. But, they kept at it. They showed us how to make these little creatures out of scrap metal. And the result of it was they started selling stuff to the missionaries. They made money. They would then be able to buy nice materials, and they have a co-op. And to this day, they're making stuff and selling it. So that's what you do. You go and you help people figure out how they want to do their own thing. This was another alphabet book project that I did in Richmond at a youth center, and they wound up making 3 different alphabet books that 2 went to the local elementary school library, 2 went to the Richmond main library, and 2 stayed at the center. This is them working with my students, creating the alphabet. So this was one of those projects where everybody walked away with something. So you can have a community project where nobody walks away with anything, right? It stays there like it's a quilt or whatever. Or you could have a project where everybody walks away with something and you leave something behind. So that's kind of what that was. And this is the one in Mexico I was telling you about. I went down there for 3 years. And this particular year we went, we worked with the girls on making a triptych about their experience at that center. So they knew who their parents were. They'd been abandoned. They could go home on the weekend if they wanted, but they always chose to come back to this orphanage. And they were learning English there, and they had this amazing toy museum. This is in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, and we'd taken them to the toy museum. So it was just wonderful working with them. And this is the last project that I worked on, which was a wellness quilt. It's a cyanotype and embroidery quilt about body, mind, and spirit, healthy body, mind, and spirit, and it's hanging in a wellness center there in Richmond. We actually had one community member that stuck out with us the whole time, which was great. So I'm going to stop it here. I mean, I'll just end it by saying a lot of what I do as an artist influenced what I do with my students in teaching. So I've done altered books with my students. I've done printmaking with the students. They wanted to make an exquisite corpse, so we made this crazy exquisite corpse. And this is a self-portrait collograph project that they did. So that's it. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments or want to have discussion about anything, but to me, the art stories, the community projects are so important. And they kind of keep me going as an artist, as a teacher. So thank you for listening.
Where can we get the book?
Oh, the book, you can get it on Amazon if you want.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's available on Amazon. It was published in 2019. And it's really a good, because a lot of times people write books, but they don't really tell you how to do anything or really tell you the secrets of how they do stuff. But the whole thing is in here. Exactly how to do it from step A to step Z if you wanted to do a community project. How you enter a community, particularly if it's not your community, how do you do that? All of that's in there, and I call it finding your community connector. Because typically there's somebody that you know who also knows the community you want to work with. Sure. So you start with them.
Yeah. And what's it titled again?
Oh, here, you want to take a picture?
Yes.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So curious about
woodcut, project in the community, and how, getting people involved who've never used a tool for woodcutting, like, there has to be.
Yeah, it was
a
crazy.
level of concern of just, because I can't imagine that's easy.
And it was a 3-week project. It was 3 weeks, we had to complete those. So this is 3 weeks summer class, right? So some people had never even made a print before. So getting them to think about making something that's like a white line was the first thing. So we did little things like, okay, here's a scratch board, make a little drawing on a scratch board. So thinking about what it would look like if you cut something out. We gave them little things to work on, little wood blocks, and then we actually had Dremel tools, and those kids were like, yeah, let me have that. I was like, oh, okay. So they were using regular woodcut tools and Dremel tools because some of those actually had words in them. I don't know if I showed you one that had words in it, but they had to do that backwards. And they were using the Dremel tool, doing it backwards. I was like, you people are just amazing, all of you. And it was just interesting because we purposely mixed the groups. So there were students from the Corcoran, students from the University of Maryland, and people from the community. So each group had at least one or more people from each of those populations in it. And then my friend who's the printmaking faculty at the Corcoran said, Pam, can I do this with you? I said, sure, come on out. So then we decided to do a faculty one. So there were 3 large woodcuts with the students in the community, and then the faculty, Melissa, Margaret, myself, and my friend from the printmaking department, we did one together. And I think the students probably turn out better than ours anyway, so we had a good time doing that, yeah.
Okay, anytime you have a group of people working on a project, the different dynamics of the personalities of those folks come into play. How did that work? Was it managed?
It's a very good question. It's been different every time. So I'll give you an example. That one where we did the alphabet books in Richmond, it was at a youth center. So it was an after-school youth center, and they didn't have any visual art programs. They had a lyrics and beats program where kids were doing raps, rap and stuff. But, and all of that was going on in one space like this. So can you imagine? There's no division. All this stuff is going on at the same time in this one space. And so I reached out to one of my faculty colleagues who was a theater person. And she said, listen, Pam, what you need are some applied theater techniques. She says, I'm going to come into your class. I'm going to teach them to you and your students. And then you and your students, when you go into the community, you can do it with them. And it was crazy stuff, like improvisational, like you have a prop, and she had all these little prompts. And so we had not met these kids. So this is February, and oddly, it was like 70 degrees. So we're outside, there's people driving by. We're in the parking lot outside doing all these crazy theater things. And they see this college professor and these college students doing this stuff, and they just had a ball. And so whatever barriers that they have thinking about, oh, here are these people from this other place, what are they going to be like? We kind of broke that down and just say we're just human beings. And part of it, like you say, that one project where their teachers were sitting at the table with them making these woodcuts, and they're like, cautiously making jokes with their teacher. And it was just, I think part of it is time, but you always have to have some sort of little exercise or something you do to help develop that community, to get it started. Like even when I'm teaching a class, the very first thing I do with my class, I do this crazy assignment called a life journey map. And I said, don't share anything you don't want anybody in the class to know. But I want you to just do a little sketch of your journey. Like, why are you sitting in this class right now? What are some things along your journey that brought you to this spot where you are right now? And they love it. I'm so surprised. And then the stuff they'll tell you, I'm like, okay, so nothing's going outside this door. But like I said, don't share anything you don't feel comfortable sharing, but you'd be surprised what people will share with you. Really. And so, and they might not ever see these people again, right? We'll probably never see those people in Nicaragua again. My student did go down there 2 more times, and she helped them. Their craftsmanship is incredible. You should see what they're making now. I noticed when we first went down there, they weren't smiling. They listened to us, they worked with us, and then by the second week, there was a lot of laughter and smiling. So she took some photographs, and it's interesting to look at the photographs. By that third week, when they knew we were going to be leaving, they started shutting down again, right? So they know, they have to, people have to have a protective mode. So if you're someplace where you'll probably never see the people again, maybe it's in another country someplace, you build the rapport you can with them. And that's why I was saying to you earlier about trust. I think the best you can hope for is to build a rapport with people, to work together on whatever you're working for in that moment. And hopefully it transforms them in some way. Like when I left the kids in Scotland, the director said, Pam, can I take this project? And I said, you can do whatever you want with it. And she got a grant, and she was continuing that project. So I think part of it is being willing to be open and vulnerable, and I think that's part of where the problem is. A lot of times people want to facilitate something, but they don't want to show any vulnerability themselves at all. They expect the other people to do it, the people they're working with. And so that's where, you kind of have to set that bar, that common ground, which is what I put on the title of the book. You're trying to find common ground with the people you're working with, and so that they see that you have more things in common than you have, you're more alike than not. So I know that sounds simple, but there's a lot of different exercises you can do, like the life journey map. You can ask people to share stories of something. You can, when we start what we call the envisioning process, which we talk about in there, when you decide what you're going to do. So let's say you have some materials. You might not have a lot of leeway on that. You might not have a huge budget. So you're going to either make a quilt, you're going to do a wood piece, a book, whatever you're going to do, because that's the materials you have. Deciding what the theme of that's going to be, what the big idea that people are coming together around should be done with the group. There's two ways I've done it. I've gone in and I said, let's make something about community. And then I'll go and I'll take a big piece of paper or I'm at a board and I'll put community down and I'll say, what comes to your mind first? So then they get this whole big brainstorming thing on the wall, and I'll say, which of these words speak to you the most? And that's what we did with that first big woodcut project with the weird pieces. They picked which groupings of words they wanted to work with. And those groups went off, and then they had to then envision what that would look like. And we didn't want them to do the typical, oh, love, draw a heart. We wanted them to push beyond that, to go deeper than the basic symbol that you see for things, the stereotypical stuff. And so they had conversations, they had sketches, and then they would put it all together. And so doing that together was also a way, right, of having them break down. And now I'm not saying that there weren't conflicts, because there was one group where there was a young person from the community, and his mother was also in the group, and there were two teachers. And the boy wanted to put a gun in there. He wasn't putting it in there as to glorify it. He was putting in there to talk about, gun violence, and the two teachers went kind of ballistic on that. And these were two of my students, and I had to go, no, you're not, you can't. And the mother said, listen, nobody's going to censor my kid's artwork. And I said, you're right. And so they had to work it out. I wasn't going to work it out for them, but they had to work it out, and they did. And he ultimately decided he didn't want to put it in there. But that kind of stuff can happen, right? So.
So, Pam, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask you, from your perspective in leadership and art education, what are some of the challenges for community-based art education in terms of its adoption in curriculum, and what are some of the joys and successes that you see in terms of art as an empowerment tool in public education?
I think that's an excellent question. So like if I have, and because I teach in both the community arts program and the art education program, in terms of thinking about those folks who are going to be K-12 teachers, I say to them, you need to show your students that they can grow up and be that artist. Who are the artists in that community? I said, look at your fellow students right here. A lot of them are going to stay here in the community. Why not have them come in? So I can remember when I was teaching high school, we were doing a self-portrait project, and this is an example of what I'm talking about. And this was at Northwestern. And the students were not into it. We were thinking, oh, they're really going to like it. So Maria and I are doing this. I'm talking to Jeff because he taught with me at Northwestern. And so Maria said, well, I know this guy. He just graduated from MICA. This was a long time ago. And she said, and he's a portrait artist, and he's from the community. We invited him in, and it was just like a light bulb went off. He was showing the kids how he starts a portrait. They were so into it after that. So what I'm saying, community could be whoever is in that school community, invite them in. It could be somebody's grandma who likes to knit, and you do a knit thing with the kids. So it shows them the value of what's already there, the assets, right, that are already there in their community, and how important it is as we as educators in schools make an opening for that to happen. It's not always about trying to get the bus that costs a fortune to go to the museum and that kind of thing. There's so many assets right there in your community. And for the teachers, the pre-service teachers, to learn about that, to learn who's in their community and what's going on. I had a student teacher one year who this was when I was in Philadelphia, and there was just a lot of trash around the school. It was really depressing. She took her money and bought a bunch of plain Keds for the kids, and they went outside and did an art walk around the school in the neighborhood. They picked up the trash. They made art with the trash on the shoes. So they had the shoes were covered with these different crazy pieces of trash, right? But the idea was learn how to take care of your community. Let's take a look at your community and what can you do to make a difference, right? So, just little things like that, I think, is one. So that's one way to think about how that could be incorporated into their curriculum. And then on the flip side of it, I'm working with students who are getting a Master of Fine Arts in Community Art, and what they're doing for the most part is they're working through AmeriCorps, a lot of them. And some of them are working with community arts centers and after-school programs in the Baltimore area. And they're working with them to come up with project ideas, because a lot of these kids, for some reason, they come there and they'll do more art in the after-school program than they will, in the school during the day. So it's interesting to look at both sides of this and think about how that's happening. But I think the point being is that we need to teach young people that art is an important way of expressing yourself and making a difference, getting a message out there. And I always say to my pre-service teachers that we have failed if we can't teach the parents how important art is, right? So if we're teaching the students how important it is and their parents, then this weird cycle of parents telling kids, no, don't go to art school because what are you going to do with that? You're not going to make a living with it, right? So somewhere that cycle has got to stop. People have to realize how important the arts are to us. I think a lot of that happened over the pandemic. How many of us heard about people doing art projects at home, because they wanted to be engaged. So, yes.
Is it, like a step that you have to take at some point to get people to put their phones down?
It's so hard. So I was telling my teachers, because they said, oh my gosh, I can't get the kids to put the phones down. In class, they're under the table like this. I said, well, find a way to do something with the phones. I know a lot of times the schools don't want to do that, but the reality is they're not going to put them down. When we were teaching, it was pagers. Put that pager away. I'm like, so funny to think about that now. And if you can find a way for them to see that as a tool, because the adults are hooked on them too. You see people walking, people are talking, and you think, oh, is somebody talking to me? No, they're talking to somebody on the phone somewhere. I think we just have to find a way to work with technology as a tool like we would with a pencil, and just not make it such a taboo thing, but maybe turn it on its head and, use it in some kind of way as a tool in the classroom.
Like you did with the argument, what you're describing is all so, hands-on and stuff.
Right, yeah.
There would be a reluctance, I would imagine.
Well, part of what happened is right when this book came out, it was 2019, and then the very next thing, we had the pandemic, and people were teaching from home. And so we're now talking about doing another version of the book where we include what sort of community stuff can you do online. And I'll give you one example. There's a woman in high school, I think it's called Artworks. They have a pizza place, and then the arts thing is upstairs. And so their idea was when people come to pick up the pizza at the window, that they could give them a pizza box with art supplies in it, right? And so the idea was to do this quilt. It was so interesting. the people would come and get the art supplies when they got their pizza. They would make this quilt, and then there was like this Zoom meeting, and everybody's holding up their work, and then there's like this screenshot, and it's the quilt. I know it sounds really, simple, but people really want to connect. We missed that when we were, online and all that. So how can you find ways to do that online? How can you do this kind of work online, right? I'm sorry, you were going to ask a question.
No, I'm so sorry for interrupting.
No, it's fine.
I was gonna say, it's like what you did with the augmented reality. You're using it as a tool.
Exactly. So people who wanted to put their their phone up to the artwork, and then they could see things popping off of it, right? Because it was from these little films that we'd made. So if you can find a way to incorporate it as a tool, then it's not like this taboo thing. But yes.
My name is Jillian. I'm the community outreach manager here.
Oh, cool.
So this is a very special talk, and I'm happy that you were here. But I just wanted to say a couple of things. We actually do have Big Ink coming here in October.
You do? Did they just reach out to you? Or does it?
We did over the summer, I think. So.
Oh, that's right, because Lyle did tell me. He told me that he was coming here.
Yeah. So we're really excited. We have 5 people signed up already.
Awesome. You all should do it. It's fun.
But then the other thing I wanted to say is we have, every month we have Creative Outlet, which is a drop-in family style, $2 per participant art project, and it's themed every month. And I just wanted to comment on what you were saying about like generational projects working together, because we'll have people come in, we'll have like the traditional like mother, father, kids come in, but then we'll have grandparents, we'll have caretakers, we'll have all sorts of different families coming in, and they all work together. And seeing what the grandparents make, even though the projects are aimed towards children, seeing what the grandparents make with their kids is always really special.
It is so fun. When I was at the Corcoran, because there was a museum, they would have these family day programs, right? So sometimes they would reach out to me and say, hey, Pam, do you want to come and do like a project for Family Day? And I said, sure. So this one particular time they had works by, oh gosh, now his name just left me, just passed recently, printmaker, anyhow, Chuck Close. So they had these works by Chuck Close upstairs, and so a lot of them were self-portraits. And so I wound up working with kids. They were supposed to be 12 and up, but it was 6. So I had kids who were 6 and their parents all the way up. And I said, what can I do with them? And so I wound up taking one of those portraits of Chuck Close, so I had a reproduction of it, and I cut it up into to pieces like a jigsaw. And it was just enough for every person. Every person got some part of Chuck Close's face. And they had just, the little styrofoam things. And you should have seen how people were working so closely with that to make sure they got exactly what they saw. And so I said, well, what color do you want to ink it up? And so we inked them up and put them all down. And they were like, wow, because, it was like his face. And they all did such a great job, even the 6-year-olds. And so, we made a couple of prints and people took them home with them. But it was a fun thing to see the parents working with their kids. And some of them were so little, but they were all very into what they were doing. So yeah, I think that's really important. I love those sort of like community day, family day things. That's just because sometimes you just don't have the time for that during the week, right? So it's important to have those programs. That's great. Oh, I'd like to hear more about it. That's great. Yeah, and congrats on Big Ink. Yeah, you should totally sign up for it. Do it at least once. It's fun. So I don't know, any more comments, questions? Thank you. Thank you for coming out on a rainy day.